How the transition from coal to oil changed the world. In contrast to oil, coal is solid. From the consumer's perspective, it comes in lumps. This fact lives on in the popular legend of the disciplinary practices of Santa Claus, who punished the naughty with just such a lump. This threat coerced children effectively because, back then, people were well aware of how nasty and dirty coal was. In contrast, today we tend to focus on coal's value as a fossil fuel, and sadly, many naughty individuals miss the point entirely. The use of coal as a fuel required a venerable but deeply unpleasant practice known as shoveling. Your memories of the home use of coal may focus on the more romantic equipment by the fireside. But even at home, coal would have to be stored in a bin, which required its own shoveling, even if this were not included in Hollywood's Christmassy images. Oil, in contrast, can be easily transported by pipeline. And with the advent of newfangled gas stations in the 1920s, shoveling became a thing of the past. To drive home how big this change was, let's go back to Hollywood for a moment. The venerable practice of shoveling was perhaps most dramatically impressed on our memories by the depiction of locomotives in old westerns. Locomotives regularly featured a fireman. No, not him. Totally different concept. The fireman's job was to shovel coal and keep the train well fired, so that it could maintain its rapid pace of 35 to 40 miles per hour. In contrast, oil provides much more energy per unit weight and can fuel the internal combustion engine. This allows much higher speeds. The internal combustion engine requires no shoveling at all. Indeed, this method is so much more efficient that, according to reliable sources, the 1981 DMC-12 DeLorean, with a few tweaks and a little plutonium, can facilitate rapid travel through time as well as space. Sadly, the creative use of plutonium is well beyond the scope of this particular course. It suffices for us that this fuel had obvious military benefits. By 1912, the British Navy had converted to oil. During the course of the First World War, use of oil allowed the introduction of the tank, an innovation that the German leadership blamed for its loss in the war. The use of the truck and automobile gave the Triple Entente a serious advantage in logistics as well. The combustion engine was here to stay. While from the consumption side, oil is fantastic, from the vantage point of production, oil is sublime. Coal, you will recall, is mined. Mining is a labor-intensive, very unpleasant, and potentially lethal task. As a result, universally, coal miners have been depicted with an emotional range between stoic and irate. In Britain, coal miners were, quite logically, the backbone of the labor movement, the people who, among other advances, brought us the weekend. In contrast, oil is capital-intensive, requiring little labor and less risk. Oil exists in subterranean pools mixed with natural gas. If the cavern is drilled into, this gas creates pressure, which pushes the oil upward. There is virtually no labor required. While this change from the vantage point of immediate human suffering was highly commendable, the decline of coal led to the end of coal miners as a potent part of British labour unions. This enabled Conservative Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher to crush the unions entirely. While the weekend has endured in Britain, not much else about the labour movement has remained the same. Oil literally shaped the urban geography of the United States during the latter half of the 20th century. After the Second World War, cars were becoming affordable for the regular Joe in the U.S. To assist sales, the automotive industry bought up public transportation systems in major metropolitan areas and dismantled them. At roughly the same time, lobbyists for property development firms pushed through legislation to subsidize mortgages for new housing. No similar subsidies were created to rebuild old housing. Suburbanization and white flight would dominate the remainder of the century as vibrant city centers became blast craters of poverty and declining property value.